Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today is the day we get AMD's annual Mega GPU driver overhaul, this year in the form of the Radeon Software Adrenalin 2020 edition, a long name befitting of a long changelog. There are lots and lots of new features in here. I'm not going to talk about all of them, and plenty of stuff is already leaked, but let's go through some of the more interesting ones before we get into the big stuff. Viotech is the kind of company you want on your side, a tech company for gamers, by gamers, dedicated to making only the best monitors at real-world prices. And here at Hardware Unboxed, we've tested and continue to recommend many of these displays. Viotech have made a name for themselves building feature-rich products that you don't have to be rich to get. All Viotech gaming monitors are protected by a zero-tolerance dead pixel policy, with customer support fully staffed in the US. And now they offer an all-new 3-year warranty. Solid performance, beautiful build, monitors that won't break the bank. Learn more at viotech.com. One of the bigger changes is the all-new design, which encompasses both the installer and the general Radeon settings interface. In my opinion, AMD has had the superior GPU control panel interface for a while now, but this new overhaul pushes them even further ahead. The new Radeon settings is fast, generally intuitive, and best of all, it gives users much more information about what settings do throughout the utility. These little tooltips are great for people that aren't familiar with some of the settings, and the general interface is just pleasant to use with a modern design. I would have liked if some of the stuff hidden away under this cog icon was a bit more exposed through regular tabs, but for stuff like global graphics and display options, AMD already has you covered with a quick shortcut in case you can't easily find it. A lot of new additions to Adrenalin 2020 edition are updates to features AMD has introduced throughout the year. For example, we now have anti-lag support in DirectX 9 games on pre-RX 5000 series GPUs, so think RX 590, etc. will now work with anti-lag in DX9 titles like Rocket League. Radeon image sharpening now works in DirectX 11 games, has adjustable sharpness strength, and can be set on a per game basis. This is all stuff I wanted to see when I looked at image sharpening, and it's great to get it here. AMD is also providing integer display scaling for the first time, joining Intel and Nvidia, who already provide this feature in their drivers. This feature allows direct pixel-perfect upscaling of low-resolution games for playback on modern high-resolution displays, which is great for retro or pixel art games that can look blurry with traditional upscaling techniques. This has been the #1 most requested driver feature, and now it's available from all 3 vendors with no performance cost. The big new feature here though is something called Radeon Boost, which is basically the focus of this video and something that got a few of our Patreon members excited in our Discord chat when it was first leaked. This is a feature I haven't seen implemented before at a driver level, so it's pretty neat that AMD is still finding cool new stuff to put in their drivers. So what is Radeon Boost? Well, you can think of this as a movement-based dynamic resolution system. When your mouse moves, and as a result you start moving around in the game, Radeon Boost dynamically lowers the game's render resolution to improve performance. The thinking here is twofold. Firstly, when you're moving, and especially moving fast, you're more likely to be in an important combat situation where higher frame rates matter. And secondly, when you're moving, you're less likely to notice small imperfections in visual quality due to a lower render resolution, as you'll either be moving too fast to spot any changes to fine detail, or you'll be too preoccupied with the game itself to nitpick changes to quality. Radeon Boost takes these two things and basically goes, hey, if you're not going to notice high resolution imagery in fast motion, and in fast motion you're better off with higher frame rates, let's provide that dynamically. And when you're not moving fast, we can still give you that super crisp resolution so you can enjoy the game's graphics. Now, dynamic resolution scaling isn't a new concept to PC gaming. However, I haven't seen it done like this before. Standard implementations in games like Gears 5 take the approach of setting a minimum performance target, say 60 FPS. Whenever frame rates are about to dip below 60 FPS, instead of letting performance drop to an unacceptable level, the game instead dynamically adjusts the resolution to keep up with the performance you desire. So when implemented properly, it works really well and has very little impact to visuals while keeping the game running nice and smoothly. Radeon Boost takes a different approach. Rather than simply setting a performance target to maintain, Radeon Boost tries to deliver you the maximum performance possible while reducing visual quality in the least noticeable way. AMD figures the best way to achieve achieve this is reducing resolution in motion, as we've just talked about, so it varies the resolution based on mouse input. There's no frame rate targets or caps or anything like that here, although you can implement a frame rate cap yourself through Radeon settings other features if you want to. And when I say Radeon Boost varies the resolution based on mouse input, that is exactly how it works. There's no scanning of on-screen content, no tapping into the game's render pipeline to figure out when performance is going to drop and adjusting things within. It doesn't even factor in keyboard inputs. It's as simple as if the mouse is moving, reduce the render resolution. If the mouse is moving a lot, reduce the render resolution more. You can see this play out in the game via the green dot icon in the top left corner. It's a tiny icon that doesn't distract you while gaming, but it is there to let you know what's going on. You'll see up to 4 green dots here, each corresponding to a render resolution. 1 dot appears when there is no or very little mouse movement, and that's native resolution. 2 dots is for slow mouse movement, meaning an 83% render scale. 3 dots for moderate movement and a 67% render scale, while 4 dots delivers a 50% render scale from fast mouse movement. These numbers refer to the change to both the horizontal and vertical resolutions. If your native resolution is 4K, 83% means 3200 by 1800, 67% means 2560 by 1440, and 50% means 1920 by 1080. So 50% scale is actually 1/4 of the native resolution, or half the vertical and half the horizontal resolutions. This sounds like a pretty large jump, but we'll see how it looks in depth in a moment. It might have been nice to see a scale with more steps, allowing for more intermediary resolutions, but it doesn't take much mouse movement to activate a 67 or 50% resolution scale, especially in fast-paced games, and generally you can expect it to bounce around a lot between the 4 modes. There are a few other things to note before we get into some testing. In Radeon settings, you do have the ability to set a minimum resolution scale to one of those 4 options, so if you find 50% is too aggressive, you can bump that up to 67 or 83%. The most important thing is that Radeon Boost is not available for all games and works off a whitelist, and the list of games is pretty small. We've just got Borderlands 3, Call of Duty World War II, Destiny 2, GTA 5, Overwatch, PUBG, Rise of the Tomb Raider, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. With such a tiny list, it makes Radeon Boost feel more like a tech demo or proof of concept than something ready for the big stage, but I am hoping that in future updates we will see more games hit the list. And it's not just the whitelist that restricts you. You'll also be needing to play in the game's DirectX 11 mode, which is extra important in titles like Borderlands 3 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider that have both DX11 and DX12 modes. It also makes me wonder how viable this technology is as more and more games switch to offering decent DX12 modes, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. Testing Radeon Boost is not as straightforward as standard game testing, as it only activates when there is mouse movement. So for the performance graphs, I've tried to use in-game sections that represent how you would play these games while still retaining repeatability and accuracy. All testing was done on my Core i9-9900K test rig with a Radeon RX 5700 XT, and at times for lower resolution testing, the Radeon RX 570. The latest driver was of course also required. I used version 19.12.2, which should become the public Adrenalin 2020 edition driver for all when it goes live right now, I believe. First up, let's explore how Radeon Boost impacts game visuals, because that's really the big deal here. Can you genuinely not notice a game dropping its resolution from 4K to 1080p in motion? Now we can cheat here and show you just the raw resolution difference using AMD's handy right shift hotkey, and you'll see the usual telltale signs of a lower resolution, but that wouldn't exactly be a fair comparison given we're looking at a static image, and Radeon Boost never lowers the resolution in these instances. So most of the comparisons you'll see here are in motion. The first one is where I saw the most obvious differences at 4K. Here we're in Borderlands 3 at the front of your ship. When panning across the glass at native resolution, everything looks fine. It's nice and crisp, all the stars look great. But with Radeon Boost enabled, we get noticeable shimmering with stars popping in and out, and that's only at an 83% resolution scale with 2 green dots thanks to relatively slow mouse movement. However, it's really only with the occasional slow pan you'll spot any differences to environment detail. When actually moving around in game or just panning around more typical game environments, I found it basically impossible to tell when the game was reducing its resolution. That's because all the objects in the game world are generally moving fast enough in these instances that I can't really resolve much detail there aside from basic information, so you can't notice a drop in render resolution. At least at 4K, where we're working from a very high base resolution, dropping down to 1800p or 1440p is very hard to distinguish, and even 1080p seems barely perceptible, so it's pretty neat. There are some very obvious exceptions though, and that's any on-screen content that remains relatively static. So that could be your gun while in a first-person game, or a character in a third-person adventure. Take Overwatch for example. When you swing around corners like in this test, you'll spot noticeable aliasing on your weapon as the resolution drops hard. This is compared to the extremely crisp presentation at native 4K. It's probably a bit exaggerated here when we pause and zoom in, but it's something I definitely noticed when actually playing the game. I spotted something similar in Shadow of the Tomb Raider here with Lara, especially her hair. Even a slight drop from native 4K to an 83% scale created shimmering on Lara's hair strands, almost as if anti-aliasing was disabled. Any sort of faster motion made the issue more noticeable, resulting in stair-stepping and jagged edge artifacts due to the crude nature of the resolution scale. I think some form of anti-aliasing would smooth things out here and make it a lot less noticeable. How noticeable this is in practice will be up to how perceptive you are while gaming. The issue was also present in a game like Borderlands 3 for example, but when I was zooming around blasting enemies, I didn't notice much shimmering or stair-stepping on my gun. It's definitely true that in motion the issues are hard to spot, but how noticeable they are in general depends on why you are moving around. If it's to enjoy the beautiful graphics, you'll probably spot some visual downgrades. If it's to shoot enemies, you probably won't notice. With that said, the resolution downscale artifacts are definitely more noticeable at lower base resolutions. At 4K, dropping down to 1440p isn't that bad, but at 1440p, an 83% scale means you're dropping down to around 2100 by 1200, 67% means 1715 by 965, and 50% is just 720p. So 2 out of the 3 downscaled options Radeon Boost chooses from are sub 1080p, and I think it really shows, especially if it's falling all the way down to 50%. In Overwatch, for example, the guns are really low resolution when it falls to 720p, while native 1440p looks pretty decent as you'd expect. For 1440p gaming, I'd recommend setting a minimum resolution no lower than 67% to avoid this, but even then 67% isn't fantastic. I wouldn't consider using Radeon Boost if your native resolution is 1080p. Dropping below this is very noticeable, even at an 83% scale, which corresponds to 1600 by 900. You'll see a fair bit of pixelation at this resolution, and I even spotted issues with environments that were hidden at 4K. Letting this game drop down as far as a 50% scale at 1080p looks awful, and I can't imagine anyone will want to play at those sorts of quality levels. And this resolution dependency isn't too surprising given what we've seen from other forms of resolution scaling. When you're up at 4K with millions of pixels to sample from, you can drop down a few notches while still retaining a lot of detail. However, if your base resolution is low, say 1080p, there just aren't enough pixel to work with if you drop below that figure, and quality quickly drops away as a result. So 4K gamers can expect the biggest improvements from Radeon Boost. The experience is average at 1440p, while I wouldn't recommend it at 1080p. What about performance? Well, there's 2 stories to tell here. One is looking at average performance, which for this sort of tool isn't the best performance indicator, as depending on what you're doing in the game, Radeon Boost is either active or inactive. Sometimes you'll get more performance, at other times you won't. Games like Borderlands 3 benefit reasonably well from Radeon Boost, as you tend to be moving around a fair bit. At 4K, using the RX 5700 XT and our hub optimized settings, I saw up to an 18% performance gain to average frame rates when the minimum resolution was set to 50%. This dropped to a 10% gain with a 67% minimum and a 6% gain with an 83% minimum. This isn't bad at all, given up to a 67% scale is virtually indistinguishable visually and 50% is very hard to spot. At 1440p, using the RX 5700 XT, gains were smaller as we became less GPU limited. Here I only saw up to a 5% performance improvement, which doesn't make Radeon Boost worth using in this title and with this configuration. It's something you'll have to experiment with depending on the resolution you want to play with and how much GPU power you have available. For example, at 1080p using the RX 570, I saw better gains than with the RX 5700 XT at 1440p, but still nothing amazing at up to 8% on average. You also might have noticed here that across the board there is virtually no change to 1% lows, which is expected given there are sections where Radeon Boost has no effect. Overwatch is the game AMD saw the largest gains in when they tested, and I found pretty significant gains as well, given it's a fast-paced game with lots of movement. Using the RX 5700 XT at 4K, I saw up to a 29% gain on average using Radeon Boost for what amounts to an insignificant visual change. At 1440p, gains were a little lower, but up to 14% is still pretty decent. Overwatch isn't a very demanding title, so you can gain a fair bit here. On the flip side, a title like Shadow of the Tomb Raider is slow paced, so it doesn't benefit much from Radeon Boost at all. I saw virtually no improvement at 1440p using the RX 5700 XT, and even at 4K I was only getting a few additional frames from a 50% minimum scale. At first, I was surprised by this, but then Boost doesn't scale down the resolution very often in this title, often at just 2 green dots, and AMD's review guide also indicates that Shadow of the Tomb Raider would give one of the lowest results in terms of performance improvements. The other story is when you look more closely at a frame rate graph. While the average performance differences might give the impression we are getting a 15 to 20% improvement all of the time, what's actually happening is some of the time we are getting no improvement, while other times we are getting significant frame rate increases. Here's a section of the Borderlands 3 benchmark run we were using earlier. As you can see, the native resolution line in blue is fairly consistent, hovering between a frame time of 18 and 22 milliseconds most of the time, which corresponds to a frame rate of between 45 and 56 FPS. At 4K, that's not fantastic, but with a variable refresh rate display, it's perfectly fine. With Radeon Boost enabled and set to a resolution minimum of 50%, the game is consistently dropping down to 1080p. At those times, you can see massive dips in the frame time graph, often delivering between 13 and 10 milliseconds or between 77 and 100 FPS. Then at other times, when there's no motion, it's running at native 4K and we get the performance we were just talking about. So we get a highly inconsistent experience, fluctuating wildly between as low as 45 FPS and as high as 100 plus FPS. It's not as bad when you set a minimum resolution of 83%, but you still see times when the frame rate will just jump up when you start moving the mouse. How much these fluctuations impact your experience depends on what you're doing. If you're moving fairly consistently to fight enemies, then having an increased frame rate can be quite beneficial. In a game like Overwatch, where my frame rate was consistently above, say, 120 FPS at 1440p, jumping up to 180 FPS isn't that jarring and provides a bit of added smoothness, especially as you're moving so often and focusing on the fight. But in other games, particularly when you're gaming below 50 FPS, suddenly having your frame rate jump over 60 FPS can be very jarring, even with an adaptive sync monitor. Most PC gamers will know the feeling when you pan around in a complex environment and your frame rate jumps all over the place. Well, a lot of the time, this is exactly what Radeon Boost will do, and it does it quite frequently. Sure, during consistent movement it might feel smoother, but the jump from not moving to moving with such a huge increase to frame rate gives a very inconsistent feel to performance. Overall, I think Radeon Boost is quite an interesting technology and a unique take on dynamic resolution scaling. The basic premise makes a lot of sense, and I think this is one of many optimizations we'll see to gaming over the coming years as we try and push up to higher resolutions, along with technologies like minimum frame rate dynamic resolution, which we saw in Gears 5, and variable rate shading, which has been introduced in games like Wolfenstein. In practice, I'd say Radeon Boost pretty much works as advertised. You move the mouse in a game, Radeon Boost dynamically lowers the resolution. Because you're moving, it's quite hard to spot the visual difference, but you gain a decent chunk to performance. There's really no issues with how it works. The resolution change is extremely responsive, it doesn't affect the UI, and it's quite easy to enable. But at this stage, I don't think it's much more than a proof of concept and a cool technical demo, and I say that for a number of reasons. One is that it's simply not supported in very many games. Yeah, it's nice to see support for still relevant titles like Overwatch, Borderlands 3 and GTA 5, but the supported games list is still extremely limited. It's also limited to just DirectX 11 titles or the DX11 modes in games that have multiple modes, which I can't really see changing anytime soon. While I found it hard to spot the visual differences in most instances, there are definitely some noticeable downgrades. Things that move less on screen, like your gun or player character, are prone to jagged edges or stair-stepping when the resolution drops, and because they're not moving as much as the environment, it can be noticeable. Slow movement can also reveal some shimmering issues. The artifacts here look very similar to anti-aliasing getting switched off when the resolution drops. Generally, I'd say it's hard to spot these issues, especially at 4K, but it's not perfect. And while the performance gains are nice, and this can be good when movement is fairly consistent, in some games having performance increase so drastically at the flick of a mouse can be jarring. How beneficial Radeon Boost will be to you will depend on the game you're playing, how you're playing, the minimum resolution target that you set, and how sensitive you are to frame rate fluctuations. I also found Radeon Boost to be most effective when you're playing at 4K. If your base resolution is 1440p, visual downgrades are much easier to spot, so I'd only give a lukewarm recommendation there. At 1080p, I definitely wouldn't recommend using it. Given 4K gaming is still very niche, that makes Radeon Boost even more niche. Where I think this sort of technology will blossom is when game developers implement it themselves rather than relying on a simple toggle in the GPU drivers. With further optimizations integrated into the game engine, this sort of dynamic resolution scaling could be much better. I'm thinking better anti-aliasing when the resolution drops, perhaps smoother transitions to lower resolutions to prevent jarring frame rate increases, and more refined movement detection. And of course, getting support in more games is also a key step that needs to be made. But I can totally see a future where we have a combination of minimum frame rate resolution scaling, movement-based resolution scaling, variable rate shading, and post-process image enhancement to deliver much better performance than we have today with very little loss to visual quality. That will really open up the doors to playing with better visual effects and higher resolutions on more modest hardware. So I am excited for what this technology can do in the future, but at least right now, I don't think Radeon Boost will see widespread use. I'm interested to hear what you guys think when you try it out, but yeah, I think this is less ready for prime time than something like Radeon Image Sharpening, for example, which is pretty much ready to go right now. That's it for this one. I'd highly recommend subscribing so you don't miss some upcoming AMD GPU coverage, which I'm sure all of you will be interested in. Do all the usual YouTube stuff, consider supporting us on Patreon or through our merch store, and I'll catch you in the next one.